This video is more about what Tantra is. Now, some of you may have heard me sharing this before, but I wanted to just create some context around what we're doing. So, at the heart of Tantra, the word itself literally means expansion of energy. So if you imagine from the time you're a young child, you're born with unlimited reserves of energy. You're born with this capacity to move and flow and express and be alive with energy moving through your body. And then as time goes on throughout your life, you take on conditioning. You hear your mum say, be a good girl. You hear your dad say, be a good boy. You hear school teachers, other adults say, don't do this, don't do that. Don't get angry, don't be sad, don't cry, don't do this, don't do that, don't touch yourself, don't do that. So many messages that we receive throughout childhood that cause our energy to contract. So instead of that energy flowing freely through the body, we shut down, we contract, and in the contracting, the base chakra, the sacral chakra, the solar plexus, all of that gets shut down. All of that where we have capacity for feeling, capacity for strong sexual energy, capacity for deep, primal, intense experiences. It's like that's where the part of us that wants to fuck and roar and scream, and the part that could go into a jealous rage, and the part that can love passionately and deeply and wildly, that's all in the lower chakras. But we decide that that's not okay. We shut it down. And there's this contraction of our energy that not only contracts us energetically, it contracts our feelings, contracts our sexual energy, contracts our capacity to express ourselves. So then we also pick this up from the adults around us, not just through the overt conditioned messages, but also the subtle and the nuanced messages. So I'll give you an example from my childhood, is that when I was a child, I remember there being this sense of contraction around sex, but not knowing why, and being aware that my parents weren't particularly teaching anti-sex messages. I never remember, being told that sex is bad or stay away from boys. But what I did remember when I went back in time, when I regressed myself and had a look, is I remembered a time, and actually I say a time, but this is something that happened regularly, that I'd be watching television with my parents or with my grandparents. And if there was any indication of intimacy on television, it could be a kissing scene, it could be leading to sex, it could be a suggestion of sex, the adults in the room would go and contract. Now, of course, I'm exaggerating it a little bit here for the purposes of demonstration, but I'm sure many of you will be familiar with it. Maybe you do it when your children are in the room. Maybe you remember it from when you were a child. And the contraction, it starts in the pelvic floor and moves through the hips, the groin, the belly, up into the lungs and the chest. And it means then the breathing becomes more shallow. And then with the more shallow breath, there's not as much feeling, there's not as much energy in the body. So what I was able to recognize in hindsight, looking back, is that the adults in my family would, at the sign of intimacy on television, because they're afraid to feel. They're afraid for their own arousal to move. They had some shame arising because there were children in the room. And so this kind of thing happens. Now, as a child, I didn't consciously know what was going on, but what happens is that as a child, children are magnetic. So somehow I was psychically sensing that in the adults around me and taking on that that's the way to be, that to contract around that energy is the appropriate path. So I learnt to contract, to shut myself down, to make myself less than, to stop myself from feeling. So then, let's say when I look back at myself as a child, I might have started to feel some of that warmth and tingling that happens through the genitals when there's some indication of intimacy. And that can happen through watching television. So let's say as a child, I felt that warmth, I felt that tingling, that kind of butterfly feeling in my genitals. Felt that. And then something in me noticed that all the adults in the room closed down. So then I learnt to close down when I felt that feeling, which then leads to a life of sexual energy being very contained and limited to the genitals, meaning that the genital stimulation is the only way that the sexual energy gets to move in the body. And when that happens, it then means that sex happens in the mind, it happens in the genitals, but there's difficulty being able to move that energy freely through the body. And when that energy is unable to move freely through the body, then we take on behaviors of pushing sexually, trying to make something happen. It also means that our lives are more shallow because we don't have the capacity to feel our feelings deeply. They just stay in this narrow range. And they stay in this narrow range because we're only breathing up here. And breathing up here limits our capacity to feeling to quite a shallow range. Whereas full-bodied breathing gives us much greater depth, much greater connection, a much greater flow throughout the body. So the version of Tantra that we're doing is essentially neo-tantra because there is a focus on sexual energy, intimacy, and relationships. If you're interested in classical Tantra is a path where you may meditate and do some yoga postures and do other practices for maybe even up to 10 years before you even got to the sexual energy practices. The reason being that in classical Tantra, there's this recognition that the sexual energy practices are really, really powerful. And they want people to have a solid foundation before they start to work with sexual energy practices. Now, for me today, living in the West, and for all of you, we don't have time to practice for 10 years before we start dealing with the sexual stuff. Also, the way I see it is sexual energy is such potent energy. It's such a powerful force in our lives. And because it is so powerful, it has the capacity to create enormous transformation. And so we want to be able to tap into that energy much sooner than meditating for 10 years and then starting. So the reason we do the self-love module first, we want everybody to be really grounded in self-love, to know who you are, to be confident with your boundaries, to have a sense of what feels good, to have a sense of being able to express yourself and express your feelings, to have some understanding of masculine and feminine energies in your body, to have a sense that you are comfortable in your skin. Because it's only through being comfortable in your skin that you can start to really move and channel the sexual energies. Now, in about 6 weeks' time or so, we will be moving into the sexual energy module. So I particularly want to use this time now as a reminder for you that it's really valuable to ground yourself, to steep yourself in the self-love practice now. It might seem like the self-love practices are simple and there's not a lot to it and you don't have a lot going on, but holding self-love as your foundation means that the sexual energy work has a base from which to flourish. It also means that later in the year, when we move into the healing and transformation work, your nervous system is equipped to be able to adjust to big energies opening and moving through you. So at its heart, Tantra is expansion of energy. Now, sexual energy is part of our vehicle for expanding energy, as well as the healing work that we do. But we want to have a really healthy base for moving that energy. We want to have a really healthy base in place before we start activating high levels of energy in the body. So please enjoy and nourish and let yourself really immerse in the self-love practices. I can't stress for you how important it is. And I would say on my journey of transformation, which has been active, well, let's say strongly active over the last 17 years, in that journey of transformation, I come back to self-love regularly. I never outgrow self-love. I never outgrow those reminders of like, oh, I've been working hard, or oh, that was a bit of a shock what I just traveled through, or oh, that's kind of tough, me facing this new aspect of myself. Those things still happen. And falling back into self-love, that sense of, oh, I've got me. I've got me. I'm holding me. I'm validating me. I'm protecting me. I'm nourishing me. And I'm loving me. We often spend maybe 20, 30, 40 years seeking external validation before we come into the true gift of internal validation. That sense of resting into our own bodies and going, that's where the magic is. That's where I am. That's how to nourish myself. So these are my self-love reminders combined with my explanation of what Tantra is, and also so that you have a deeper understanding of why I've packaged the work together in this way. It's no accident. I've been exploring the Tantra space for 14 to 15 years now, and through that exploration really keep coming back to how important self-love is as the basis for all the other work that we're going to do together. So if you have any questions, feel free to pop them in the Facebook group for me, and I look forward to seeing you all soon.